There is a particular kind of laughter that powerful men deploy when they want to make clear they are not afraid. It is not the laughter of surprise, or of genuine amusement, or of relief. It is a performance, a way of communicating to everyone in the room that the person they are laughing at does not warrant the dignity of being taken seriously. Prescott Hargrove III had been using this laugh his entire adult life. He used it in board meetings when a junior analyst questioned his numbers. He used it in negotiations when the other side made a demand he had already anticipated and preempted. He used it in a Senate hearing room in 2019 when a senator from Ohio held up a spreadsheet and asked him to explain the pension fund transfer. He used it the way other men use silence as a weapon. The laugh said, "I am untouchable. You know it. I know it. And your knowing it is, frankly, the funniest thing in the room." He used it on a Wednesday morning in March when his head of security, a former Secret Service agent named Douglas Reeves, brought him a letter. The letter was handwritten. 1 page. No return address. It had been slid under the door of his private office on the 34th floor, a floor that required biometric access, a personal escort for any visitor, and a security log that captured every entry and exit. The handwriting was deliberate and unhurried, the kind of cursive that suggested someone who had taken the time to write it properly, the way people used to. Reeves had already dusted it for prints. There were none. The envelope had no DNA on the seal. It had been closed with a damp sponge, not a tongue. Whoever sent the letter had prepared for the follow-up before they sent it. Hargrove read it once, set it on the desk, and read it again. Then he leaned back in his chair and laughed. The letter stated 4 things. First, that the writer was aware of the master agreement, the original signed document, that sat in Hargrove's personal vault, also on the 34th floor, behind a door that required 2-factor biometric clearance and a 6-digit rotating code. Second, that this document was the instrument by which 4,200 steelworkers in Youngstown, Ohio, had lost their pension benefits over a span of 18 months through a series of transfers and reclassifications that were technically legal and morally unambiguous. Third, that on Friday of the following week at midnight, the writer intended to remove that document from the vault. Fourth, and finally, that Hargrove would know who had taken it and why when he opened the vault on Saturday morning. No signature, no threat, no demand, just a statement of intent, written in the same tone one might use to announce a dinner reservation. Hargrove handed the letter to Reeves and told him to triple the overnight rotation, upgrade the access control system on the 34th floor, and have a forensics team sweep the office for any surveillance device that might have given someone enough information to write that letter. Reeves asked if they should contact the police. Hargrove looked at him the way he looked at everyone who underestimated what a private security budget could accomplish, and said that whoever wrote the letter would be in federal custody by Thursday, and that contacting the police would only mean explaining the letter to a detective who would leak it to a journalist. He told Reeves to handle it internally. Then he picked up his phone and went back to work. He genuinely believed the letter was a bluff. He had the kind of certainty that accumulates over decades of walking away from things that should have stopped him. Investigations that went nowhere. Settlements that stayed sealed. A documentary that was quietly shelved after a phone call to the distribution company's largest investor. He had been told at various points in his life that someone was coming for him by regulators, by plaintiffs' attorneys, by a former colleague who had grown a conscience at exactly the wrong time. They were all wrong. He was still here. The letter would not be different. The vault sat in a room off his private office with no windows and no ventilation grill. When the vault was first installed, Hargrove had insisted that there be no structural opening of any kind in the walls of that room. The room was climate-controlled through a system integrated into the building's HVAC, with sensors that maintained temperature and humidity without requiring any physical access from outside the vault room itself. The vault was a Diebold Guardsman model built to withstand a direct torch for 4 hours and a hydraulic spreader for 6. The door required a palm scan on the right hand, a retinal scan for the right eye, and a 6-digit code that rotated every 72 hours through an encrypted algorithm that Hargrove alone controlled from an app on a phone that had never connected to a public network. Reeves had reviewed the vault's security protocols when Hargrove first hired him, and had told Hargrove, with the professional detachment of a man who had spent 15 years assessing physical security at the highest levels, that the vault was impenetrable under any scenario he could model. Hargrove had nodded and told Reeves that this was the correct answer. The 34th floor beyond the vault room was itself a controlled environment. 8 security personnel rotated in 2 4-person shifts, 12 hours each. The elevator required a key card that changed codes every 24 hours. The stairwell doors on the 34th floor were locked from both sides and could only be opened with the same key card system, with a secondary pin that was issued fresh each morning. Every inch of the floor was covered by cameras with no blind spots. Reeves had walked the layout personally when they designed it, and had added 2 cameras specifically to cover the angles that the original installer had missed. The building's main security desk in the lobby maintained a live feed of the 34th floor at all times, with a dedicated monitor that was never unattended. Reeves ran his sweep of the office. No surveillance devices. He ran a check on every person who had legitimate access to the 34th floor going back 60 days. 12 people total, including Hargrove. Every one of them was accounted for, with no anomalies, no unusual behavior, no gaps in their access logs that suggested anything other than normal work activity. He interviewed the overnight cleaning crew who serviced the floor. 3 people. All with clearances that had been vetted 3 years prior, all of whom had been escorted by a security officer on every visit per standing protocol. Nothing. He expanded the sweep to the building's exterior. The tower was 51 stories of steel and glass in the middle of Midtown Manhattan, on a block where the nearest building with a sight line to the 34th floor windows was 400 feet away and 9 floors lower. Even if someone had positioned a long-range camera in that building and managed to capture Hargrove entering his vault PIN, which would have required a military-grade optical setup and a clear line of sight through glass with a low reflection coating, the retinal and palm scans were not reproducible by any technology available outside a government laboratory. The access codes rotated, the personnel were vetted, the cameras had no blind spots. By Thursday evening, Reeves briefed Hargrove with a conclusion that was delivered in the flat tone of someone who had done the work and arrived at a result he was entirely confident in. There was no viable entry point. The letter was a provocation from someone with either incomplete information about the security setup or a fantasy about their own capabilities, or both. Hargrove told Reeves to add 4 more personnel to the overnight rotation on Friday, not because he believed it was necessary, but because he wanted whoever had written the letter to understand the scale of what they had walked into. Reeves added the 4 personnel. He also installed a secondary motion sensor in the vault room itself, covering the area between the door and the vault, and connected it to an alarm that would alert him directly on his phone, bypassing the building's general system. He set up a physical checkpoint at the elevator bank requiring a secondary verbal confirmation from the overnight shift supervisor before any access was granted after 10 p.m. He was thorough. He was methodical. He had spent 15 years building systems exactly like this one, and he had never had a breach. He also authorized the building management company to proceed with a scheduled upgrade to the 34th floor's access control server, an upgrade that had been in the queue for 6 weeks and that the building's facilities coordinator had asked about twice. The upgrade required a 4-hour window during which the 34th floor's access logs would run through a secondary backup server while the primary system was updated. The window was scheduled for Friday night, starting at 11 p.m. to minimize disruption. Reeves noted it in the log, confirmed that the backup server would maintain all security protocols, and moved on. It was a routine facilities matter. He had approved 3 similar upgrades in the past 2 years without incident. He did not think about the letter when he approved it. He would think about it later, at considerable length, but not that night. If you were the kind of person who has watched someone take a hit they deserved, and felt for one brief moment something that is not quite satisfaction but is its neighbor, if you have ever watched the careful, quiet, specific collapse of a system that was built to protect the wrong people, then you understand the particular quality of attention that a story like this one deserves. Stay with this. If this is your first time here, consider this an introduction to the way things can go when someone decides that the rules were written by the wrong people and declined to keep playing by them. The gentleman's game is what this channel is for. Here is the question worth carrying into what comes next. If someone sent you a letter telling you exactly what they were going to do and when, and you had every resource available to stop them, what would that certainty feel like? And would it occur to you even once that the certainty itself might be the trap? There are cities that produce a particular kind of pragmatism. Not cynicism, not hope, but something that sits between the two, like a man on a front stoop watching the street with no particular expression, waiting for what comes next. Youngstown, Ohio, is one of those cities. It used to have something different, a specific kind of industrial pride that came from making something real, from the knowledge that what came out of those mills fed families and built things and left a mark on the physical world. The steel industry gave Youngstown its identity, the way a river gives a valley its shape over time without announcement. And then, in the span of about 20 years, it took most of that identity back. The man who had come to be known, to those who knew of him at all only as the gentleman, was born in a house 6 blocks from one of those mills. His father worked a furnace. His mother kept the books for a dry cleaning business on the east side that had been in her family since the 1940s. He was the kind of kid who noticed things, not in a way that made him popular or difficult, but in a way that simply made him accurate. He noticed which teachers gave the same test 2 years in a row. He noticed which local politicians showed up only in election years. He noticed that the mill where his father worked began reducing shifts in the fall of a year when the quarterly reports filed with the SEC showed record profits. And he pulled those filings from a public terminal at the Youngstown Library and read them until he understood what he was looking at. He was 16 years old. What he understood was that the money was still there. It had just been moved somewhere else. His father lost his pension when the Hargrove Group completed its acquisition of the mill's parent company through a series of asset transfers that reclassified pension obligations as legacy liabilities and moved them into a subsidiary that was subsequently dissolved. This was in 2003. His father had worked that furnace for 22 years. The pension he lost was $840 a month. It was the difference between his parents staying in their house and leaving it. They left it. His father died in 2011 of a heart attack at 61. His mother still lived in the apartment they had moved into after the house. The gentleman had left Youngstown at 18 on a scholarship, studied economics and applied mathematics, and spent the years after graduation accumulating a very specific kind of knowledge that does not appear on any resume. He learned how access worked, not just physical access, but social access, the kind that comes from being the person who is expected to be there, whose presence raises no flags because the flags are designed to catch a different kind of threat. He had a code that governed every decision he made with the consistency of a physical law. He did not touch people who were not in the game. He did not break commitments. He did not operate from anger. Anger was a variable, and variables were liabilities. He had been watching Prescott Hargrove III for a long time before the letter. Hargrove was 63 years old, the third generation of a family that had made its first money in coal extraction in Pennsylvania in the 1890s and had converted that money into successive forms of institutional control, banking, insurance, real estate, and finally private equity, which was the most efficient mechanism yet discovered for taking a thing apart and distributing the parts to people who had not built it. Hargrove had gone to Exeter and Yale, spent 3 years at Goldman before deciding that working for someone else's fund was transitional, and had launched the Hargrove Group at 31 with $140 million of family capital. The financial press described his clarity of vision, consistently and without irony, as brilliant. The Hargrove Group had completed 63 acquisitions in 30 years. 41 of those companies had been restructured in ways that eliminated or reduced pension obligations. The number of workers who had lost benefits was not a number that appeared in any Hargrove Group document, because there was no legal requirement that it appear anywhere. And Hargrove had not become what he was by producing documentation that was not required. He kept the original master agreement from the Youngstown acquisition in his personal vault because his corporate attorneys had told him at the time of the transaction that it was the one document that needed to stay out of discovery. Not because it was illegal. It was not technically illegal, but because it was specific. It named the mechanism. It showed, in the handwriting of the people who designed it, what the intention was, and the intention was not the kind of thing that played well in any forum. Hargrove had kept it because destroying it felt, to a man who kept score, like erasing a win. He had won. The document was the record of that win. He was not in the habit of throwing away records. He had no memory of the names of the workers whose pensions were eliminated. This was not a moral statement. It was just true. There were 4,200 of them, and he had never met any of them. And the transaction had been handled by a team of 12 attorneys and 3 accountants. And by the time it was done, Hargrove was already 3 acquisitions later. He did not dislike the workers of Youngstown. He simply did not think about them. They existed in his mental landscape the way weather exists, as a condition that had to be accounted for operationally, but that did not require any particular feeling. The document existed. The vault existed. The letter arrived. And Hargrove laughed. This is what made him, from the gentleman's perspective, an interesting subject. Not the crimes. The crimes were ordinary by the standards of what the industry produced. What made him interesting was the certainty. The absolute, structural, well-evidenced certainty that he could not be reached. He had never been reached. Every system he had ever relied on, legal, political, financial, physical, had held. The laugh was not performance for Reeves's benefit. It was genuine. He actually found it funny. The gentleman had factored this into the plan from the beginning. The Hargrove Tower was a 51-story building on 6th Avenue that had been constructed in 1987 as part of a development deal that involved 3 different city agencies, a rezoning, and a series of tax abatements that had, over the years, saved the Hargrove Group somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million in municipal taxes. The building management was handled by a company called Meridian Property Services, which maintained a facilities staff of 22 people across 3 shifts, handled all vendor relationships, and coordinated the maintenance and upgrade schedule for every system in the building. Building management companies of this kind are the connective tissue of large commercial properties. The people who know which elevator needs its hydraulics serviced, which floor's HVAC fan coil units are running past their rated lifespan, and which contractor gets the call when a building system needs to be updated. The gentleman had been employed by a company called Atlas Technical Services for 14 months. Atlas Technical Services was a building systems contractor that specialized in access control and HVAC integration, specifically in the software that governed how building management systems communicated with security hardware. It was a legitimate company with a legitimate client list. It had a contract with Meridian Property Services. That contract had been in place for 11 months when Meridian's facilities coordinator, a man named Lou Garza, who had worked in building management for 20 years and who wore the same brand of work boots every day, and kept a photograph of his daughter's soccer team pinned to his cubicle wall, put in a request to Atlas for a technician to handle a scheduled access control server upgrade on several floors, including the 34th floor of the Hargrove Tower. The gentleman was the Atlas technician assigned to that job. He had been patient about the assignment, not passive. There is a difference. He had worked at Atlas, done the work, learned the systems, and waited for the calendar to produce what he needed. He had not manufactured the upgrade request. Garza had put it in because the building's primary access control server on the upper floors was running firmware that was 3 versions out of date, and Meridian's contract with the security hardware vendor required firmware updates within a specific maintenance window. The request was entirely routine. The timing was Hargrove's misfortune, or depending on how you looked at it, a piece of scheduling that the gentleman had spent 14 months positioning himself to be present for. He had studied the building's systems with the attention that his father had once given to the furnace, knowing exactly what temperature it needed to be, what sounds meant it was running right, and what sounds meant it wasn't. How to read the behavior of a complex machine from details that anyone less attuned would not have noticed. The 34th floor's access control setup had one structural characteristic that Reeves's sweep had identified and dismissed. During the firmware upgrade window, the floor's access logs ran through a backup server with a slightly different audit trail format. Not a gap, not a blind spot, a seam. The gentleman was not going to walk through a gap. He was going to walk through the building as exactly who he was. A credentialed, scheduled, documented Atlas technician performing a job that had been requested by the building's facilities coordinator, logged in the building's maintenance system, and approved by the security team in writing 3 days prior. He had an Atlas ID badge with his photograph and employee number. He had a work order printed on Atlas letterhead. He had the specific firmware update files on a company-issued laptop, along with the documentation that showed the update had been tested and certified for this hardware configuration. He had Lou Garza's contact number in his phone, which Garza had given him personally when he walked Garza through the scope of work at a meeting 3 weeks earlier. He did not have a disguise. He was not pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was exactly who his credentials said he was, a building systems technician doing a scheduled job. The invisibility was not in the costume. It was in the category. in the mental model that security systems, however sophisticated, rely on to sort threats from non-threats. A man with a work order, a company badge, and a prior approval from the facilities coordinator who sent the original request is not a category that triggers review. Not because the system is stupid, because the system is correct 99,000 times out of 100. It was correct this time too, in every sense, except the one that mattered. He arrived at 11 p.m. He checked in at the lobby security desk, showed his ID and work order, and was logged in by the overnight desk attendant, a young man named Terrell, who had been working the night shift for 8 months and who was working toward a degree in computer engineering on a schedule that required him to sleep during the day and study on his breaks. Terrell called up to the 34th floor, confirmed the work order with the shift supervisor, and issued a temporary building access card. He noted the entry in the log with the same care he gave everything. Terrell was not a person who cut corners. The gentleman thanked him and took the elevator. On the 34th floor, the shift supervisor, a former NYPD officer named Ray Montes, 12 years on the force before a knee injury changed his career path, met him at the elevator and walked him to the server room, which was in a different part of the floor from Hargrove's private office. Ray was polite and professional and not inclined to small talk at 11 p.m. He confirmed the work order against his own copy, which Reeves had forwarded to all overnight supervisors that week, watched the gentleman open the server room, and then went back to his post at the desk that monitored the 34th floor cameras. The server room had its own camera. Ray could see it from his monitor. The gentleman did the work. He ran the firmware update on the primary access control server. This was not a cover. The update was real. The process was legitimate, and it ran exactly as documented. It took 90 minutes. During those 90 minutes, the 34th floor's access logs ran through the backup server. At 12:04 a.m., Reeves's phone received an alert from the motion sensor he had installed in the vault room. By 12:11 a.m., Reeves was in his car, already moving toward Midtown. He called Ray on the 34th floor and told him to lock down the elevator and check every person on the floor against the access log. Ray confirmed 4 Hargrove security personnel, 1 overnight cleaning staff member who had been on the floor since 11:40 and was in Hargrove's personal office, and the Atlas technician in the server room. Ray looked at the server room camera. The technician was at the server rack with his back to the camera working. Reeves arrived at the building at 12:23 a.m. He took the elevator to 34. He walked directly to Hargrove's office suite, through the outer office, through the inner office, to the vault room door. The vault room door was closed and showed no sign of forced entry. He used his own access to open it. He stepped inside. The vault door was closed. The motion sensor's log showed a single trigger at 12:04. Nothing since. He ran the vault's access log. No entries. The biometric system had not been activated. The code had not been entered. The vault had not been opened. He stood in the vault room for a moment and ran through the sequence again. Motion detected. Vault door closed. No access logged. He walked back out and checked the ventilation sensors in the room, all within range, no anomaly. He looked at the vault room camera feed. The camera showed the vault door, undisturbed. He reviewed the previous hour of footage. Nothing. The room had been empty since 9:15 p.m. when the last member of Hargrove's daytime staff had left. He went back to the server room. The Atlas technician was packing up his tools. The firmware update was complete. The technician showed Reeves the completion log on his laptop and handed him a signed work order for Garza's files. Reeves approved the work order. The gentleman took the elevator to the lobby, thanked Terrell, and walked out onto 6th Avenue. Hargrove arrived at the office at 8:15 the following morning. Reeves briefed him at 8:30 with the report of the motion sensor alert and the subsequent sweep, which had found nothing. His conclusion was that the sensor had been triggered by a building vibration, possibly the HVAC system cycling, which could produce minor vibrations in the vault room floor where the sensor was mounted. He had checked the HVAC maintenance log and noted that the building's air handling unit for the upper floors had run a calibration cycle at 12:03 a.m., 1 minute before the alert. He had marked the incident as resolved. Hargrove listened. He did not comment on the Atlas technician. There was no reason to comment on the Atlas technician. The technician had been in the server room, visible on camera, doing a scheduled job. Reeves did not connect the technician to the vault room because there was nothing to connect. The vault room had not been entered. The vault had not been opened. Nothing was missing. At 9:45 a.m., Hargrove went into his private office and opened the vault. He did this because it was Saturday morning, and he had a quarterly review document in the vault that he needed for a call at 11, and because if he was being precise about his own psychology, he wanted to confirm for himself what Reeves had already confirmed. He opened the vault door. He looked inside. He stood there for what later he would calculate as about 4 seconds, though it felt shorter than that, because 4 seconds is a long time when everything you are certain about is in the process of changing. The master agreement was gone. In its place, centered on the shelf where the document had sat in its archival folder, was a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy, a high-quality one, done on a machine with sufficient resolution to reproduce every signature, every initial, every handwritten notation in the margins. The photocopy was of the first page of the master agreement. On that first page, in the upper right corner, there was a name, one of the 4,200, printed in the document's original tabular format as a pension plan participant. The name was circled in red ink. Below the circle, in the same deliberate cursive as the letter, were 2 words. He remembered. No signature, no demand, no instruction about what was supposed to happen next. Hargrove stood in front of the open vault for a long time. He was not a man who was accustomed to the specific weight of that kind of silence, not the silence of a decision still to be made, but the silence of a situation already concluded. The document was gone. Someone had taken it, and whoever had taken it had done so in a way that left him with no forensic evidence, no legal recourse, and no story he could tell to anyone who mattered without explaining why the document existed and what it said. He could not report the theft. The document he would have to describe was the instrument of a transaction that his attorneys had advised him 20 years ago to keep out of discovery. Walking into a police station to report its theft was not an option. Calling the attorney who had helped design the transaction was also not an option. That attorney had been in federal prison for an unrelated matter since 2018, and anything connected to that name carried its own set of problems. He could call Reeves. He could have Reeves investigate. He could spend an enormous amount of money and time trying to find the person who had done this. He looked at the photocopy. He looked at the name with the red circle around it. He looked at the 2 words below it. He closed the vault. He sat down in his chair and looked at the wall of his private office, and for the first time in a career built on the certainty that he was operating at a level where accountability was a concept that applied to other people, he felt the specific disorientation of someone who has just discovered that the room they have always lived in has a window they never noticed, and that somebody, at some point, had been looking through it. He canceled the 11 o'clock call. Have you ever been told something was impossible? heard it from someone with every credential to make that judgment, watched them build their case with real evidence and real logic, and known in the part of you that doesn't traffic in credentials or logic that they were wrong, not because you could prove it, just because something in the shape of the situation didn't add up, and no amount of official confidence was going to change that feeling. That is approximately what it felt like in the days and weeks that followed for everyone who tried to figure out what had happened on the 34th floor. Reeves ran 3 separate investigations. The first concluded that the vault had been opened by someone with access to both Hargrove's biometric data and his rotating code, a conclusion that required either a breach of the hardware manufacturer's systems, which the manufacturer denied, or an inside job, which the access logs contradicted. The second concluded that the motion sensor alert had not been a vibration artifact from the HVAC calibration cycle, because the vibration analysis showed insufficient amplitude to trigger the sensor's threshold. The third concluded that the Atlas technician's presence on the floor, while coincidental in timing, could not be connected to the vault room by any evidence, and that the firmware update he had performed was legitimate, documented, and unrelated to the vault room's access control hardware. Everything Reeves found was accurate. The problem was that accurate and complete are different things, and what he was looking at was a result, not a mechanism. The Atlas technician's employment with Atlas Technical Services ended 8 days after the Hargrove job. He had submitted his resignation by email on Monday morning, citing a personal relocation. Lou Garza processed the paperwork, noted that the technician had completed all outstanding work orders, and wished him well. There was no forwarding address. His employee file, reviewed as part of Reeves's third investigation, was clean and complete. Every certification current, every reference checked, every employment record consistent. He had worked there for 14 months and had done the job correctly every time. The name circled in red on the photocopy was a man named Walter Kowalski, who had worked in the number 4 furnace room of the Youngstown Mill for 23 years, and who had been 61 years old when his pension benefits were eliminated. Walter Kowalski had died in 2009. His wife, Denise, was 74 years old and lived in the same apartment on the east side of Youngstown, where they had moved after selling their house. She received a Social Security check each month that was, by the standards of what she needed to live without worry, not quite enough. She did not know why, on a Tuesday morning in April, she received a cashier's check in the mail for a sum that was the exact total of the pension benefits her husband had lost, calculated to the month, including a reasonable estimate of what 21 years of compound growth would have produced if the pension fund had been allowed to operate as intended. There was no note, just the check. She called her daughter to ask if she knew anything about it. Her daughter did not. Denise sat at her kitchen table for a long time looking at the check, trying to find the category for it, trying to make it fit the world she knew. It didn't quite fit, but she deposited it. She was not the only one. The gentleman's tally, running through a series of transfers across 14 months that would have required an auditor with a specific mandate to untangle, was not limited to Denise Kowalski. It was smaller than the full 4,200 that was not possible in a single operation. It was targeted. The names had been selected according to a logic the gentleman had worked out over time, beginning with the people whose situations were most acute. He did not advertise this. He did not write about it or announce it or leave a calling card for anyone in this part of the plan. The work was the work. It did not require an audience. In the weeks after, Hargrove did something that surprised Reeves, who had been watching him long enough to have a sense of his patterns. He did not escalate. He did not pour resources into the investigation beyond the 3 rounds he had already authorized. He did not convene a crisis management team or call in additional counsel. He went back to work. He took his calls and attended his meetings and appeared at a charity gala in the Hamptons in early May, where he was photographed with a senator from Connecticut and smiled for the camera with the ease of a man who has decided that the smile is what the situation requires. Reeves interpreted this as strategic equanimity, the choice of a man who understood that public behavior was itself a form of communication, and that panic was information he was not willing to share. This interpretation was not wrong, but it was also not complete. The truth, which Reeves did not have access to, was that Hargrove had spent a considerable amount of time in the weeks after the vault thinking about the photocopy. Not about the theft, not about the mechanism, about the 2 words below the circle. He remembered. He had read the Youngstown name and not recognized it, which was not surprising. He had never known the name. But the photocopy had sat on his desk for one evening before he locked it away, and he had read the first page of the master agreement again. And for the first time in 20 years, he had read it as a document rather than as a transaction. The numbers were on the first page. The pension fund value, the reclassification structure, the signature lines, the date. It was all there in the way that things are there when you look at them directly, which was different from the way he had always looked at it before, as a completed move, a record of a win, filed away. He was not a man who was given to what therapists call processing. He had not thought about Youngstown in years, but the document, brought back into the light by the photocopy and the red circle and the 2 words, had a quality of specificity that his usual instruments for managing discomfort, work, distance, the forward momentum of the next deal, were not, in those particular weeks, entirely effective against. He did not do anything about this. He did not call anyone in Youngstown or consider any action that would have amounted to a correction. He was not that person. He knew this about himself. But the photocopy remained in the drawer of his desk, which was unusual, and on evenings when he stayed late, he occasionally took it out and looked at it. Not the name with the circle, but the first page of the agreement, the numbers, the structure, the signatures, including his own, done at 35 when his handwriting had been slightly different than it was now. This was not a transformation, but it was a crack. The gentleman spent 3 days after the Hargrove job at a rental house on the south shore of Lake Erie that he had booked under a name with a legitimate paper trail going back 4 years. The lake in early April has a particular quality of gray and cold that is not unfriendly. It is just honest. He ran in the mornings on a gravel path along the shoreline, made his own food, and read. What he felt was closer to the completion that a craftsman feels when a piece of work is finished correctly. Not the exhilaration of a gamble that came in, but the quieter satisfaction of a plan that held every piece of it, from the first day at Atlas to the last. He thought about his father without the heavy, practiced grief of someone still working through a loss, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who has carried a thing long enough to understand its shape. His father had not been angry in the way that Youngstown had taught some people to be angry. He had simply worked and believed that working correctly would produce the results it was supposed to produce, and had been wrong. Not because his understanding of the deal was wrong, but because the deal itself had been changed by people who had the power to change it and no particular reason not to. The gentleman had understood this at 16, looking at those SEC filings on the library terminal, and had spent the years since understanding it more precisely. He did not think the Hargrove job had fixed anything structural. The document was gone. Hargrove's ability to operate was unchanged. The system that had allowed the Youngstown transaction to occur, and the 62 other transactions like it, was intact, as systems tend to be. What had happened was specific, not systemic. 14 people who needed the money had received it. Hargrove had learned that his vault was not untouchable, which was a small education and not a reformation. He thought this was an honest accounting and was comfortable with it. On the second morning, he ran about 8 miles along the shore and back, and at the furthest point he stopped and looked at the lake for a while. The water was moving with an indifference to what happens on the shore that is not cruelty, just scale. He stood there until the cold made it impractical and then turned and ran back. He thought about what Reeves would be looking for and whether he would find it. Probably not. Not because the investigation was incompetent, but because the mechanism was not in any file Reeves had access to, and because the thing that had made everything possible was not a breach in any system that could be patched. It was a condition. The condition was that people who build fortresses think about threats from outside, and that the furniture of the normal world, the technician with the work order, the scheduled upgrade, the 14 months of clean employment history, is invisible because it is supposed to be invisible. That is what normal looks like. The job requires you to look like it. There was one moment in the execution that Reeves would not be able to explain and would not stop trying to explain. It was the moment that made the vault accessible without triggering the vault's own access log, the moment that made the motion sensor fire and then go quiet, the moment that put the calling card in the exact position it needed to be in. The gentleman knew precisely how it had worked. He had spent 9 months working out the specific sequence. He would carry that sequence, and he would not deliver it to any audience because the knowledge was not the point. The effect was the point. A single photocopy, a circled name, 2 words, and the silence that followed. There is something specific about the moment when a person who has spent years believing they are immune to accountability discovers they are not. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just a vault door opening on a Saturday morning, a document missing, and a piece of paper sitting where the document used to be, and the slow, uncomfortable arrival of the understanding that someone was watching and waiting, and knew exactly what they were doing, and did it without leaving a single thread that leads anywhere useful. Hargrove had won every game he had ever played by his own accounting. And the accounting was largely accurate. He had won because the game had been designed in his favor, not with a guarantee, but structurally, in the way that a court favors the side that can afford to litigate indefinitely. He had won because the people who might have held him accountable had been convinced over time that the cost of doing so was too high, or that the evidence was insufficient, or that legal and right were close enough to proceed. He had not accounted for the possibility that someone was playing a different game on a different timeline with a different metric of success. Not the legal system's metric, not the financial system's metric. Something older and simpler and harder to fortify against. The metric of this happened, and the person it happened to deserved something for it, and you deserved to know that someone knew. The gentleman had not asked for recognition. He had made a specific promise in a letter that named the date and the target, and said only what it intended to do. He had kept that promise. The keeping was complete. Denise Kowalski had deposited her check. She called her daughter, who came over that weekend, and Denise said something her daughter later described as the most practical thing her mother had ever said. She didn't know where it came from and had decided it didn't matter, because wherever it came from, it was what was owed, and she had waited long enough. Then she went to the bank on Monday morning, deposited it, came home, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat in the chair by the window that had been Walter's chair. She looked out at the street for a while. Then she got up and started making plans. So here is what we know, and here is what we don't. We know the document left the vault. We know it has not surfaced. No journalist has published it. No regulatory agency has received it. No courtroom has seen it. The gentleman took it and kept it, for reasons only he understands. Maybe it is insurance. Maybe it is the record of a win kept for different reasons than Hargrove's. Maybe it is simply gone from the place where it did its damage, and that is sufficient. We know the calling card worked. The 2 words on the photocopy were chosen with precision, not a signature, not a boast. Just the minimum required to communicate what needed to be communicated. I knew. I came for it. I left this so you would know both things. We know that 14 people in Youngstown and in 2 other cities where the Hargrove Group had made similar moves received checks that month. The money was real. It arrived. The people who received it are doing better. What we don't know is the mechanism. The specific sequence that made the vault accessible without triggering the log. The thing that made the motion sensor fire at 12:04. These are not questions this story is going to answer, because the story knows what the gentleman knows. The mystery is the product. What makes something worth holding in your mind past the moment of the telling is precisely the part that isn't explained. The magician doesn't tell you where the card went. That's why you're still thinking about it. The game isn't rigged because they're smarter. It's rigged because they decided the rules. Some people, rare, patient, specific people, have figured out that you don't have to play by rules someone else wrote. You just have to learn the shape of the board well enough to move through it without being seen. Not forever. Just this once. Just enough. He gave them notice. He named the date. He said what he was coming for. They laughed. They built a wall. The wall was the plan. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, if you find yourself turning it over later, asking the question that doesn't quite have an answer, then you're already in the right place. Like this episode if it landed. Subscribe if you want to see how the next impossible move gets made. And here is the question to take with you, different from the one we started with. When someone laughs at a warning, what are they really revealing about the limits of what they're willing to see? The gentleman has his answer. He always did.